In 1793, amidst the blood and terror of revolutionary France, one man harbored a secret far more lethal than the looming shadow of the guillotine. The Church condemned it as a sin against nature, while the starving masses spat upon it as a disease of the depraved aristocracy. Had the truth of what transpired behind his bedroom doors been revealed, he would have forfeited not just his life but his eternal soul. He did not desire women. His heart beat only for other men. Yet, history had prepared a twist of supreme irony for this trembling figure. This timid lawyer, who spent his existence looking over his shoulder in terror of his own nature, would rise to become the second most powerful man in an empire destined to bring Europe to its knees. He did not seek to be a martyr. He sought only to survive. But in doing so, he weaponized the very fear that enslaved him to engineer one of the most profound silent revolutions humanity has ever known. He did not wave a banner or scream for liberation in the streets. Instead, hidden securely within the colossal shadow of Napoleon, Jean-Jacques-Régis de Cambacérès rewrote the moral fabric of a continent with a single calculated stroke of his pen. The man who manipulated the law merely to keep his own head would inadvertently become a forefather of modern human rights. How did a lawyer paralyzed by the fear of exposure craft the legal silence that would, centuries later, become the shield for millions like him? The roots of this silent power lay far from the blood-soaked streets of Paris. He was born in 1753 in Montpellier, a sun-drenched city in the south of France. It was a world away from the grime and fury of the capital. He was born into the nobility of the robe. In old France, there were two types of nobles. The nobility of the sword were the knights, the warriors, the dashing figures who rode into battle. The nobility of the robe were the judges, the magistrates, the bureaucrats. They fought with paper. They destroyed their enemies with lawsuits. Cambacérès was a child of the inkwell. His father was a mayor. His family had been interpreting the law for generations. While other boys played at war, Jean-Jacques was reading jurisprudence. He was an awkward child. He wasn't handsome. He wasn't athletic. He was quiet, observant, and possessed a terrifyingly sharp memory. He grew up in a France that was slowly rotting. The laws made no sense. A peasant in Montpellier paid different taxes than a peasant in Lyon. A noble could beat a servant to death and pay a fine. A servant who struck a noble would be broken on the wheel. The system was a tangled mess of feudal privileges, religious decrees, and royal whims. Young Cambacérès saw this chaos and hated it. He had a mind that craved order. He looked at the map of France and saw a broken puzzle. He wanted to fix it, but he also realized early on that he was different. He didn't share the romantic interests of his peers. In the conservative Catholic south of France, he learned the art of the mask. He learned to be polite, to be charming, to say exactly what people wanted to hear, and to never, ever let anyone see what was really happening inside his head. He became a lawyer, and a brilliant one. By the time the revolution broke out in 1789, he was a respected magistrate. He could have stayed in Montpellier. He could have hidden in his family estate and waited for the storm to pass. But ambition is a strange drug. When the call went out for representatives to go to Paris and build a new world, Cambacérès couldn't resist. He packed his trunks, filled with books and fine clothes, and headed north. He was walking straight into the fire. Paris in the early 1790s was a city that had lost its mind. The revolution, which began with hope and the Declaration of the Rights of Man, had descended into paranoia. The dominant figure was Maximilien Robespierre, the incorruptible. Robespierre believed that terror was necessary to cleanse the Republic. He saw traitors everywhere, in the bakeries, in the army, and especially in the government. Cambacérès Now a member of the National Convention found himself in a nightmare. His colleagues were disappearing. Every day the carts rattled over the cobblestones, carrying politicians, poets, and generals to the Place de la Révolution to be shortened by a head. This is where Cambacérès proved his genius. Most men in his position made the mistake of taking a side. If you supported the Girondins, the moderates, the Jacobins, the radicals, would kill you. If you supported the Jacobins too loudly, the other factions would target you. Cambacérès chose the plain. This was the derogatory name for the silent majority of deputies who sat on the low benches of the convention, avoiding the extremes of the mountain where the radicals sat. They were also called the Marsh or the Frogs. He became the king of the frogs. He didn't make fiery speeches. He didn't denounce people. Instead, he made himself indispensable. He worked on committees. He drafted reports. He handled the boring, grinding details of logistics and finance that the revolutionaries were too busy screaming to notice. Robespierre needed someone to actually write the laws he was screaming about. He looked at Cambacérès and saw a tool, a quiet, obedient, efficient tool. He didn't see a threat. He didn't see a rival. This was Cambacérès' greatest camouflage, his competence. He made himself so useful that killing him would have been an inconvenience. But it was a terrifying existence. He slept with one eye open. He kept his bags packed. He burned his personal letters. He stopped attending dinner parties. He became a ghost in his own life. There's a story from this time that illustrates his fear. One evening, a friend tapped him on the shoulder in the street. Cambacérès jumped, his face pale, trembling. When he saw it was a friend, he whispered, "I thought my time had come." He was living on borrowed time, and he knew it. The crime of his private life was a constant sword of Damocles. The Jacobins preached a republic of virtue. They hated aristocracy, they hated corruption, and they hated sexual deviance. If Robespierre had decided to turn his gaze on Cambacérès' private evenings, no amount of legal brilliance would have saved him. So Cambacérès became a monk of the law. He channeled all his energy, all his repressed passion into his work. He began drafting a civil code, the first attempt to unify the laws of France. It was an impossible task in the middle of a civil war, but it gave him a reason to exist. It gave him a shield. "Do not disturb citizen Cambacérès," they would say. "He is writing the laws of the Republic." The fever finally broke in July 1794. The month was Thermidor in the revolutionary calendar. The convention, terrified that Robespierre was about to kill them all, finally turned on him. In a chaotic, bloody coup, Robespierre was arrested. He tried to shoot himself in the jaw, failed, and was dragged screaming to the guillotine. The terror was over. Most men would have celebrated. Most men would have sought revenge. Cambacérès did neither. He immediately went to work stabilizing the government. He became the president of the Committee of Public Safety, the very organization that had been sending people to their deaths just weeks before. But under his leadership, the machine stopped killing and started governing. He oversaw the peace treaties. He reorganized the justice system. He was the adult in the room. But he was also looking for a new patron. The government that followed the terror, the Directory, was corrupt and weak. It was a rotating door of incompetent politicians looting the treasury. Cambacérès knew it couldn't last. France was bankrupt. The armies were restless. The people were starving. They didn't need a committee. They needed a sword. Cambacérès began to watch the reports from the front lines. There was a young general making a name for himself in Italy, a man who won impossible battles, a man who wrote letters that sounded less like military reports and more like the decrees of a Roman Caesar, Napoleon Bonaparte. Cambacérès had never met him, but he recognized the type. He saw the ambition, the energy, the ruthlessness. He realized that this little Corsican artillery officer was the future, and Cambacérès intended to be part of that future. The first meeting between Napoleon and Cambacérès is one of those moments that historians often overlook, but which determined the fate of Europe. It happened in 1799, shortly after Napoleon returned from his campaign in Egypt. He was the most famous man in France. He was planning a coup d'etat to overthrow the Directory. He needed allies. He needed someone who knew how the government worked, someone who could legitimize his seizure of power. He invited Cambacérès to dinner. Imagine the scene. Napoleon, 30 years old, sunburnt, thin, vibrating with nervous energy, eating his food as if he were refueling a machine. Cambacérès, 46, portly, elegant, dissecting his pheasant with the precision of a surgeon, savoring the sauce. Napoleon spoke of glory, of destiny, of a new France. Cambacérès listened. He didn't fawn over the general. He didn't offer empty flattery. Instead, he asked practical questions. How will you pay the army? What is your legal standing? How will you manage the Senate? Napoleon was stunned. He was used to sycophants or enemies. He had never met someone who looked at his grand visions and immediately began constructing the scaffolding to hold them up. By the end of the dinner, a pact had been formed. Napoleon would be the face, the sword, the voice. Cambacérès would be the brain, the hand, the pen. When the coup of 18 Brumaire took place on November 9th, 1799, it was a messy affair. Napoleon almost botched it, getting flustered in front of the deputies. But the legal groundwork had been laid perfectly. The transition was smoothed over. The consulate was established. Napoleon was named first consul. Cambacérès was named second consul. The partnership had begun. And for the first time in his life, Cambacérès was not just surviving, he was ruling. But as he moved into the spotlight, the whispers began. The new regime was supposed to restore order and family values. Yet the man standing next to Napoleon was a bachelor with a taste for velvet and young male secretaries. The British press began to sharpen their knives. The royalists in exile began to laugh. How long could he last? Napoleon was known for discarding people once they were no longer useful. Cambacérès had climbed to the top of the mountain, but the air was thin and the drop was steep. He needed to make himself so essential that Napoleon would forgive him anything. He needed to create a masterpiece. By 1800, France had a new master, but it was being run by two very different men. To the public, the consulate was all about Napoleon Bonaparte. He was the face on the gold coins, the name in the newspapers, the hero reviewing the troops on a white horse. He was the embodiment of masculine energy, aggressive, decisive, and tireless. But behind the closed doors of the Tuileries Palace, the government was a domestic partnership. If Napoleon was the husband of the state out fighting wars, making demands, and dreaming of glory, Cambacérès was the wife. He stayed home. He managed the household accounts. He settled disputes between the servants, the ministers. He made sure there was food on the table and that the bills were paid. This analogy was whispered in the salons of Paris, sometimes with a sneer, but it was devastatingly accurate. Napoleon knew how to conquer. Cambacérès knew how to govern. Their routine was grueling. Napoleon would wake at 2 a.m., dictate letters for 4 hours, take a hot bath, and then demand a meeting. Cambacérès, who preferred a civilized start to the day, adapted. He was always there. He was always prepared. Napoleon had a habit of having brilliant, terrible ideas. He would pace the room, shouting about digging a canal to the sea or rewriting the tax code overnight. A weaker man would have agreed. A more foolish man would have argued. Cambacérès did neither. He would listen, his face a mask of polite interest. He would take a pinch of snuff from a gold box, and then he would gently, methodically dismantle the emperor's bad ideas. "Sire," he would say, "that is a magnificent vision. However, Article 42 of the Constitution might present a delay, or the Treasury reports indicate that such a move would bankrupt the naval budget by June." He never said no. He just showed Napoleon the consequences. He guided the volcano. This dynamic created a bond of trust that was almost unbreakable. Napoleon was paranoid. He trusted almost no one, not his brothers, not his generals, certainly not his wife Josephine. But he trusted Cambacérès. He gave him a special key to his private study. He allowed him to open the emperor's mail. In a world of betrayals, Cambacérès was the one man who simply wanted to do the job. He had no desire to be emperor. He knew he didn't have the charisma or the military genius. He was content to be the shadow, as long as the shadow was comfortable, well-fed, and powerful. The greatest fruit of this partnership was not a battle, it was a book. Despite the revolution, the legal system remained the same fractured nightmare Cambacérès had despised in his youth. It was still a patchwork of over 300 different legal systems. In the north, they clung to customary law based on old Germanic traditions, where a father could practically sell his children. In the south, they used Roman law based on ancient statutes. The church had its own laws. The king's old decrees were still floating around. It was a nightmare for business and a nightmare for justice. You couldn't buy land, sign a contract, or get married without tripping over 5 contradictory statutes. Napoleon wanted a single law for a single people. He wanted a civil code that would unite France. He appointed a commission of 4 brilliant old lawyers to draft it. But the driving force, the man who chaired the meetings and kept the peace, was Cambacérès. This was his element. For months they met in the heavy tapestried rooms of the palace. The debates were vicious. They were arguing over the fundamental building blocks of society: marriage, divorce, property, inheritance, debt. Napoleon often attended these meetings. He wasn't a lawyer, but he had a terrifying common sense. He would cut through the legal jargon. "Don't tell me what the Romans did," he would shout. "Tell me what is fair for a French farmer today." Cambacérès sat at the emperor's right hand. When Napoleon got too heated, Cambacérès soothed him. When the old lawyers got bogged down in Latin pedantry, Cambacérès steered them back to reality. He had a vision for the code. He wanted it to be secular. The church would no longer control marriage or birth records, the state would. He wanted it to be clear. He insisted that the laws be written in simple, concise French, not legalese. He wanted a peasant in a field to be able to read the law and understand his rights. The result, finalized in 1804 as the Code Civil des Français, later the Napoleonic Code, was a masterpiece. It guaranteed equality before the law for men. It protected private property. It separated church and state. It was the operating system of the modern world. But inside this monument to order, Cambacérès hid a secret that would save thousands of lives and change the history of human rights, though almost no one noticed it at the time. The question of morality was central to the new code. The revolution had destroyed the old religious morality, and Napoleon wanted to bring order back. He wanted strong families. He wanted fathers to have authority. In the old regime, and in almost every other country in Europe, sodomy was a capital offense. It was a crime against God and king. Men were burned alive for it in the 1780s. When the legal commission reached the section on penal crimes, they had to decide what to punish. They listed murder, theft, treason, fraud. But when it came to the private sexual conduct of consenting adults, Cambacérès made a deliberate choice. He did not write a law legalizing homosexuality. That would have been political suicide. The church would have screamed. The British would have used it as propaganda. Instead, he used the weapon of silence. He simply left it out. The new Penal Code of 1810, which Cambacérès oversaw, punished public indecency. If you had sex in the street, you went to jail. It punished non-consensual acts. It punished acts with minors. But it contained no mention of sodomy, no mention of crimes against nature. He refused to reintroduce the crime. By ensuring this omission remained in the new imperial code, he cemented a permanent shield into the law. It was a triumph of Enlightenment logic over religious dogma. Cambacérès believed that the law had a limit. The state's job was to prevent citizens from harming each other. What two men or two women did behind a locked door did not harm the state. Therefore, it was not the state's business. This was not an accident. It was the calculated act of a man who knew exactly what it meant to live in fear. Because of this silence, France became an island of relative safety in a hostile continent. When Oscar Wilde was destroyed by the British legal system a century later, he fled to France. Why? Because of the silence Cambacérès wrote into the law. When French armies marched into Italy, Spain, and the Netherlands, they brought the code with them, decriminalizing homosexuality across Europe. Cambacérès never gave a speech about gay rights. The concept didn't exist. He didn't wave a banner. He just quietly, methodically erased the weapon that had been pointed at his throat his entire life. While he was rewriting the laws of civilization, Cambacérès was also living a life that was becoming the talk of Paris. He was now the arch-chancellor of the empire. He was incredibly rich. He bought a magnificent townhouse in Paris. And he stopped hiding. He didn't come out in the modern sense. You couldn't do that. But he stopped pretending to be something he wasn't. He never married. He stopped attending events where a hostess was required. Instead, he created his own world. His dinners became legendary. Cambacérès was a gourmand of the highest order. He believed that diplomacy was best conducted over a plate of truffle-stuffed chicken. He micromanaged his kitchen. He would inspect the produce himself. If a fish wasn't fresh enough, he would throw a tantrum that he never threw in a cabinet meeting. The guests at these dinners were almost exclusively male. Judges, senators, young officers, poets. The food was rich, the wine was rare, and the conversation was brilliant. But there was a code within the code. The Parisians, with their sharp wit, noticed the young men who seemed to always be around the arch-chancellor. They noticed that his secretaries were often very handsome and not always very busy with paperwork. They called him Tante Hurlurette, Auntie Hurlurette. They made jokes about his confraternity of the hat. One famous anecdote involves the arch-chancellor walking in the gardens of the Palais Royal. This was a known cruising ground for gay men in Paris. Cambacérès, dressed in his official finery, would stroll through the gardens nodding to acquaintances. It was a brazen display. He was the second most powerful man in the empire, walking through a market of vice, daring anyone to say a word. And no one did, at least not to his face. This was the power of his competence. If you were a senator and you wanted a law passed, you had to go through Cambacérès. If you were a general and you wanted a promotion, the paperwork crossed Cambacérès' desk. You could joke about him behind his back, but you bowed when he entered the room. The only man who could have destroyed him was Napoleon. Napoleon was not a progressive man. He was a Corsican traditionalist. He wanted men to be soldiers and fathers. He disliked effeminate behavior. Yet, his relationship with Cambacérès is one of the most fascinating contradictions of his reign. Napoleon knew everything. His police chief, Fouché, provided him with detailed reports on everyone's private life. Napoleon knew who Cambacérès was sleeping with. He knew about the young men. He didn't care. In fact, he protected him. There were times when other officials tried to poison the emperor's mind against the arch-chancellor. They would whisper about the scandal. Napoleon would shut them down instantly. "The arch-chancellor is a man of honor," Napoleon would snap. "His private life is his own." There was even a teasing affection between them. Napoleon would sometimes joke about Cambacérès' lack of a wife or his love of fashion. Cambacérès was a dandy. He loved velvet coats, diamond rings, and gold braid. Napoleon, who dressed like a simple soldier, found this hilarious. One day, Cambacérès arrived at a meeting wearing a particularly elaborate coat. Napoleon looked him up and down and laughed. "Cambacérès," he said, "you look like you are about to fly away." But the teasing never turned to malice. Napoleon realized that Cambacérès' isolation made him loyal. A man with a wife and ambitious children might plot to seize the throne. A man with a shameful secret, a man who depended on the emperor's protection to survive, would never betray him. Cambacérès was the perfect number 2 because he could never be number 1. By 1808, the empire was at its zenith. Napoleon controlled Europe from Madrid to Warsaw. Cambacérès was a prince of the empire, the Duke of Parma. He was loaded with honors, but the work was killing him. Napoleon's ambition was becoming a sickness. The wars never stopped. Every year, there was a new campaign, a new conscription of 100,000 boys, a new enemy. Cambacérès began to feel the weight of the structure he was holding up. He was the one who had to go to the Senate and demand more money and more blood. He was the one who had to explain why the war in Spain was a disaster, which it was. He started to warn Napoleon. "Sire," he would say, "the people are tired. Sire, the treasury is empty." Napoleon stopped listening. He had become addicted to victory. He started to see Cambacérès not as a wise counselor, but as a nagging old woman. "You are always afraid, Cambacérès," Napoleon would shout. "You don't understand glory." Cambacérès understood glory perfectly. He understood that glory was expensive and glory was fleeting. He looked at the map and he saw the cracks that Napoleon was too blind to see. He retreated more into his private world. His health began to suffer. He gained weight. He became even more obsessed with ritual and etiquette, as if by organizing the dinner table perfectly, he could stop the world from falling apart. He was a lonely man in a crowded room. He had power, yes, he had wealth, but he had no legacy of his own blood. His legacy was ink on paper. And as he watched Napoleon march 600,000 men toward the Russian border in 1812, Cambacérès felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter. He knew with the instinct of a man who had survived the terror that the blade was about to fall again. 1812 began with bad omens. A comet streaked across the sky, visible over Paris for months. The superstitious whispered it meant war, plague, or the death of kings. Cambacérès didn't look at the stars. He looked at the logistics reports, and what he saw terrified him. Napoleon was assembling the largest army the world had ever seen. 600,000 men, horses, cannons, wagons stretching for miles. The destination was Russia. Cambacérès begged him not to go. In the gilded chambers of the Tuileries, the arch-chancellor finally dropped his mask of polite agreement. He argued with the emperor. He pointed out that the war in Spain was still an open wound, draining 200,000 men and millions of francs. He argued that England was still blockading the ports. He argued that the Russian winter was an enemy no cannon could kill. "Sire," he warned, "nature has limits, and so does fortune." Napoleon dismissed him with a wave of his hand. "You have become an old woman, Cambacérès," the emperor scoffed. "You want to enjoy your dinners and your soft bed. I am making history." When Napoleon rode out of Paris in May 1812, he left Cambacérès in charge of the empire. This was the arch-chancellor's role, the designated driver of the state while the emperor went joyriding into the apocalypse. For months, Cambacérès ran France from his desk. He read the bulletins of victory that Napoleon sent back: Smolensk taken, Borodino won, Moscow entered. The newspapers cheered. The church bells rang. But Cambacérès knew the truth. He saw the secret police reports. He knew the economy was stalling. He knew the people were muttering in the breadlines. He sat in his magnificent townhouse, eating his exquisite meals, feeling the vibration of an earthquake before the ground actually cracked. The crack happened on the night of October 23rd, 1812. It was a bizarre event that proved just how fragile the empire really was. General Claude François de Mallet was a madman, or perhaps a genius. He was a staunch Republican who hated the emperor. He was currently locked up in a mental asylum in Paris. On a rainy night, Mallet escaped. He put on a general's uniform he had hidden. He walked into a barracks and announced to the sleepy commander, "The emperor is dead. He was shot in Russia on October 7th. It was a lie, a total fabrication, but it worked. The colonel believed him. Mallet took command of a troop of soldiers. He went to the prison and released 2 other generals. He went to the Ministry of Police and arrested the minister. Within 4 hours, this escaped mental patient controlled half of Paris. Why? Because everyone believed the emperor could die. And this is the crucial point, because nobody knew what to do without him. When the news reached Cambacérès the next morning, the coup had already collapsed. Mallet had been recognized and arrested, but the arch-chancellor was shaken to his core. It wasn't the coup that terrified him, it was the reaction. When the officials heard Napoleon is dead, not a single one of them shouted, "Long live Napoleon II." Napoleon had a son, the King of Rome, a toddler sleeping in the palace. By law, he was the heir. But in the panic, everyone forgot the boy. They forgot the dynasty. They just panicked. Cambacérès realized the horrifying truth. The empire wasn't a state, it was a man. If the man died, the machine would stop. All his work, all the codes, all the administration, it was all smoke. When Napoleon finally returned from Russia in December, having left his frozen, dying army behind in the snow, he was furious. He burst into the Tuileries, face gray with exhaustion, and screamed at Cambacérès. "Why did no one think of my son?" he roared. "I spent 10 years building a dynasty, and at the first rumor of my death, you all acted like the Republic was back." Cambacérès stood there, head bowed, taking the abuse. He didn't say what he was thinking. "We didn't think of your son because you have made yourself a god. And gods don't have heirs. They just leave voids." The years 1813 and 1814 were a slow, agonizing slide into the abyss. Napoleon was now fighting the whole world. The Russians, Prussians, Austrians, and British were closing in. Cambacérès became the voice of doom. Every time Napoleon returned to Paris to raise a new army, Cambacérès was there whispering, "Negotiate, make peace, save the throne." He advised Napoleon to give up Germany, to give up Italy, to accept the natural frontiers of France. "Sire," he said, "it is better to be king of France than an emperor in exile." But Napoleon was a gambler chasing his losses. He believed one more great victory would fix everything. He stripped the country bare. He drafted teenagers, the Marie-Louises, they were called, boys of 16 who didn't know how to ride a horse. Cambacérès had to sign the orders. He had to send these children to die. The man who hated violence, the man who fainted at the sight of blood, was now the chief logistics officer of a slaughterhouse. His health began to fail. He suffered from nervous colics. He stopped eating. The stress was eating him alive. He was watching his life's work, the stable, orderly France of the Code, being pulverized by artillery. He also faced a personal danger. As the Allies advanced, the Royalists in France began to stir. They remembered 1793. They remembered that Cambacérès had voted for the death of Louis XVI. Pamphlets began to circulate in Paris. They called him the regicide. They called him the sodomite arch-chancellor. They promised that when the king returned, Cambacérès would hang. For the first time in 20 years, the survivor didn't know if he would survive. March 1814. The end was here. The Allied armies were at the gates of Paris. Napoleon was fighting a brilliant but hopeless campaign in the countryside, trying to cut their supply lines. But he was too far away. Cambacérès was in Paris, technically in charge of the Regency Council protecting the Empress, Marie-Louise, and the 3-year-old King of Rome. He faced a terrible choice. Napoleon had sent strict orders. If the enemy threatens Paris, move the Empress and my son. Do not let them be captured. I would rather see my son dead than in the hands of the Austrians. But the council argued. Talleyrand, the slippery diplomat who was already plotting to betray Napoleon, argued that the Empress should stay. If she leaves, Talleyrand said, the cause is lost. The people will see it as desertion. Cambacérès looked at the frightened Empress. He looked at the little boy. He knew that if they stayed, they might be hostages. If they left, the empire was over. He chose obedience. He chose the letter of the law. The emperor's orders are precise, he said. We must depart. It was a gloomy, pathetic procession that left the Tuileries on March 29, 1814. A dozen heavy carriages, loaded with gold, papers, and the crown jewels, rolled out of the courtyard in the rain. Cambacérès rode in one of them. He looked out the window at the silent, sullen crowds. No one cheered. No one cried. They just watched the government run away. He knew he was leaving his power behind. He was leaving his wine cellar, his beautiful house, his young friends, his dignity. He was fleeing like a criminal. Paris surrendered the next day. The Russian Tsar rode down the Champs-Élysées. Napoleon abdicated a week later. He tried to commit suicide by drinking poison, but he vomited it up. He was exiled to the island of Elba. The empire was dead. Cambacérès didn't go to Elba. He wasn't a soldier. He was a bureaucrat. And bureaucrats don't go on romantic exiles. He stayed in France. He tried to make himself invisible again. The Bourbon king, Louis XVIII, returned. He was the brother of the king Cambacérès had voted to kill. The royalists were baying for blood. They purged the army. They purged the administration. But they didn't touch Cambacérès, not yet. Why? Because the king was smart. He looked at the French legal system, the tax system, the police, and he realized he couldn't run any of it without the men who built it. Cambacérès was stripped of his titles. He was no longer Your Serene Highness. He was no longer Arch-Chancellor. He was just Monsieur de Cambacérès. He retreated to his house. He thought perhaps he could live out his days in quiet retirement. He thought the storm had passed. But history has a wicked sense of humor. Just as the dust was settling, just as France was starting to accept the return of the king, a ship landed in the south of France. March 1815. Napoleon was back. The 100 days had begun. And for Cambacérès, this was not a triumph. It was a disaster. He knew that if Napoleon returned, the war would start again. And he knew that he would be forced to choose sides one last time. Napoleon marched on Paris. The king fled. The emperor arrived at the Tuileries, carried on the shoulders of cheering soldiers. One of the first things he did was send for Cambacérès. Cambacérès didn't want to go. He told his friends, "This is madness. It will last 3 months, and then we will all be ruined." He went anyway. He walked into the palace, saw the man who had destroyed his peace, and bowed. "Welcome back, sire," he said. Napoleon smiled. "Well, Arch-Chancellor, we have work to do." Cambacérès looked at the emperor and saw a dead man walking, but he took his seat at the desk. He picked up his pen. The machine had to run, even if it was running off a cliff. The spring of 1815 was the strangest season in French history. They called it the 100 Days, but for Cambacérès, it felt like a fever dream. Napoleon was back in the Tuileries, but the magic was gone. The emperor was fatter, slower, his face pasty and lined with exhaustion. The government officials who rushed back to serve him weren't driven by hope. They were driven by fear. Fear of the Bourbons, fear of the emperor, fear of the future. Cambacérès accepted the position of Minister of Justice, but he did so with the enthusiasm of a man walking to the gallows. He refused the title of prince. He refused to live in the official palace. He kept his bags packed. He told a close friend, "I am serving a man who is already dead. We are just waiting for the funeral." During these 3 months, Cambacérès saw the fatal flaw in the man he had served for 15 years. Napoleon knew the Allies were coming with 1 million men. He needed to unite France. He needed the liberals, the Republicans, the people who hated dictatorship. Cambacérès advised him, "Sire, you must give them a constitution. You must give them liberty. You cannot rule as a tyrant anymore." Napoleon tried. He brought in Benjamin Constant, a liberal writer he had once exiled, to draft a new constitution. But in private, the emperor fumed. He hated parliaments. He hated voting. He wanted to be the god of war again. Cambacérès spent his days in the Ministry of Justice, trying to keep the legal system from collapsing under the strain of civil war. In the Vendée, royalist rebels were rising up. In the south, mobs were attacking Bonapartists. And in the salons, the whispers against Cambacérès turned into screams. The royalist press, now operating underground, released venomous cartoons. They depicted the Arch-Chancellor as a grotesque, effeminate glutton, holding a scale of justice that was tipped with sausages. They mocked his singular tastes openly. For 15 years, his power had silenced the homophobia of his enemies. Now that his power was crumbling, the hatred poured out. He ignored it. He worked. He signed the papers. He waited for the end. On June 12, 1815, Napoleon left Paris for the Belgian border. He had gathered one last army. He was going to face the British under Wellington and the Prussians under Blücher. Paris held its breath. On June 18th, the sound of distant thunder could be heard or imagined by those with sharp ears. It was the Battle of Waterloo. For 3 days, there was no news. Then came the rumors. A great victory. The British destroyed. Then the truth arrived. It didn't come in a bulletin. It came in the form of the emperor himself. Napoleon rode into Paris at 8 a.m. on June 21st. He didn't look like a conqueror. He was covered in mud, his eyes hollow, his uniform torn. He had ridden for days without sleep. He collapsed into a chair at the Élysée Palace and asked for a bath. Cambacérès went to see him. The room was filled with weeping ministers and shouting generals. Some wanted to dissolve the parliament. Some wanted to arm the workers of Paris. Cambacérès looked at the man he had helped build into a legend. He saw that the battery was finally dead. All is lost, Cambacérès reportedly whispered to a colleague. The only thing left is to save the furniture. By furniture, he meant the state, the legal code, the administration, and of course his own neck. Napoleon abdicated for the second time. He asked for 2 frigates to take him to America. Instead, he surrendered to the British and was shipped off to a rock in the South Atlantic called St. Helena. Cambacérès never saw him again. Now came the reckoning. The Bourbons returned, and this time, Louis XVIII was not in a forgiving mood. The ultra-royalists, men who had spent 20 years in exile nursing their hatred, took control of the Parliament. They wanted revenge. They wanted to purge France of the virus of the Revolution. A wave of violence swept the country. It was called the White Terror. In the south, Mamluks who had served Napoleon were massacred in the streets. Generals were dragged from their homes and shot. Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, was put on trial for treason and executed by a firing squad. Cambacérès was terrified. He fit every category of the enemy. He was a regicide. He voted for the death of Louis XVI. He was a high official of the usurper, Napoleon, and he was a sodomite. He locked himself in his house. He dismissed his servants. He waited for the police to knock on the door. But the knock didn't come. The king, Louis XVIII, was a pragmatic man. He knew that killing Cambacérès would be complicated. Cambacérès knew where all the bodies were buried, literally and metaphorically. He knew the secrets of half the noble families in France. Instead of a trial, the king used a law. In January 1816, the law of amnesty was passed. It granted a pardon to most people except for one specific group, the regicides who had supported Napoleon during the 100 Days. They were banished from France forever. It was a cold bureaucratic sentence. No guillotine, no prison, just get out. Cambacérès was 62 years old. He was tired. He was rich, but his wealth was tied up in properties in France. He was given 24 hours to leave Paris. He packed a few trunks. He said goodbye to his closest friends, the few who dared to be seen with him. He got into a carriage and headed north toward the border. As he crossed out of France, he must have looked back at the country he had fundamentally redesigned. He had given it its laws, its administration, its structure, and now it was spitting him out. He settled in Brussels. It was a common refuge for the exiles. The great painter Jacques-Louis David was there. The old revolutionaries were there, grumbling in cafes, wearing their threadbare coats, reliving the glory days of 1793. Cambacérès was different. He had money, he rented a nice house. But he was miserable. Brussels was cold. The food was terrible, by his standards. The wine was overpriced. But the worst part was the irrelevance. For 20 years, his desk had been the nerve center of Europe. Every morning he had decided the fate of millions. Now, his biggest decision was what book to read or what soup to order. He was a pariah. The British tourists who visited Brussels would point him out in the park. "Look," they would say, "that fat old man on the bench. That's the arch-chancellor. That's the man who helped kill a king." He bore it with dignity. He didn't write angry memoirs defending himself. He didn't plot to overthrow the king. He simply existed. He found solace in religion. The man who had helped secularize France, who had stripped the church of its power over the law, began to go to Mass every day. Perhaps it was genuine repentance. Perhaps it was just a need for ritual, for the comfort of a structure that didn't change with the political winds. But even in exile, his singular tastes followed him. The police spies of the king were watching him. Their reports from Brussels are petty and cruel. They noted that he was often seen in the company of a young valet named Jean-Louis. They speculated on the nature of their relationship. Even stripped of all his titles, the world couldn't stop obsessing over who he slept with. By 1818, the anger in France had cooled. The ultra-royalists had overplayed their hand, and the king wanted to move on. Cambacérès petitioned for permission to return. He claimed ill health. He claimed he just wanted to die at home. The king granted it. But there were conditions. He could not use any of his old titles. He was not Your Highness. He was not citizen. He was just Jean-Jacques. He could not hold office. He could not attend court. He returned to Paris in late 1818. The city had changed. The tricolor flags were gone, replaced by the white flag of the Bourbon. The statues of Napoleon had been pulled down. Cambacérès moved back into a smaller house. He was a ghost in the machine he had built. He would walk through the streets of Paris and see the courts in session. The judges were wearing the robes he had designed. They were citing the Code Civil, though they now called it the Code of the French. They were using the procedures he had written. The system was working perfectly. It just didn't need him anymore. He reconnected with a few survivors. He held small dinners, though they were pale shadows of the imperial banquets. The conversation was cautious. They didn't talk about the emperor. They talked about the weather, the opera, the price of truffles. There's a touching story from these final years. One day at a dinner, a young liberal lawyer began to praise the Napoleonic Code. He spoke passionately about how it secured liberty and equality. He didn't realize that the old sleepy man at the head of the table was the one who had written it. Cambacérès smiled gently. He didn't correct the young man. He didn't claim credit. He just took a sip of wine and said, "It is a good law. Let us hope it lasts." He knew that the man, Napoleon, was the temporary part. The law was the permanent part. Napoleon had wanted to build an empire of swords. Cambacérès had built an empire of words. And the words were winning, but the body was failing. The years of stress, of rich food, of fear caught up with him. By 1823, he could barely walk. His digestion, once his greatest joy, ruined him. He prepared for the end with the same meticulous attention to detail he had applied to the state. He wrote his will. He organized his papers. He made sure his servants were provided for. He was ready to argue his final case before the ultimate judge. March 1824. Paris was gray and damp. In a quiet bedroom on the Rue Saint-Dominique, the man who had once run the Western world was struggling to draw breath. Jean-Jacques-Régis de Cambacérès was 71 years old. The massive frame that had once been draped in the gold-embroidered velvet of the arch-chancellor was now frail. The mind that had memorized thousands of Roman statutes was clouding over. He died on March 8, 1824. It was not a state event. There were no cannons firing from the Invalides. There were no weeping crowds in the streets. The newspapers mentioned it, but they were careful. The Bourbons were still on the throne, and praising a regicide was still dangerous. His funeral was held at the church of Saint Thomas d'Aquin. It was a respectable bourgeois affair. A few old colleagues from the days of the empire attended. Their uniforms mothballed. Their glory faded. They looked at the coffin and saw the end of an era. He was buried in Père Lachaise Cemetery, the city of the dead that overlooks Paris. If you go there today, you can find his tomb. It is not a pyramid. It is not a triumphal arch. It is a solid, heavy, rectangular monument. The inscription does not list his titles. It does not say Arch-Chancellor of the Empire or Prince of Parma or Second Consul. It simply says Jurist and Patriot. It was the final edit of a man who spent his life editing reality. He stripped away the politics, the wars, the titles, and the scandals, leaving only the two things that actually mattered to him, the law and the country. But as the earth was shoveled over his coffin, the world assumed that Cambacérès would be forgotten. He was just a bureaucrat, after all, a footnote in the biography of Napoleon. But history works in strange ways. The world was wrong. Napoleon was dead, his body rotting in a nameless grave on a rock in the middle of the ocean. But Cambacérès was about to achieve immortality. Napoleon had once said, "My true glory is not to have won 40 battles. Waterloo will erase the memory of so many victories. But what will live forever is my civil code." He was right. but he was taking credit for another man's work. As the 19th century marched on, the French empire of borders and armies disappeared, but the empire of law that Cambacérès built began to conquer the world. When Belgium became independent, it kept the code. When Italy unified, it used the code as its blueprint. When the Dutch modernized their laws, they looked to what Cambacérès had written. It crossed the oceans. In Louisiana, in the United States, the legal system today is still based on the French Civil Code, a strange island of civil law in a sea of English common law. In Quebec, Canada. In Egypt, in Latin America. Why? Because it was brilliant. Cambacérès had managed to distill the complex mess of human interaction into clear, logical rules. He made the law a machine that anyone could operate. He had created a system that didn't care who the king was. It didn't care if France was a republic, an empire, or a monarchy. The contracts still held. The marriages were still valid. The property lines were still drawn. Cambacérès had realized something that Napoleon never understood. Stability is more powerful than glory. People will cheer for a conqueror, but they will only obey a legislator. But there is a second legacy, one that was hidden in the silence of the text, which is perhaps even more profound. For centuries, the sin of Sodom had been a capital offense in Europe. It was a crime against God, punishable by fire. When Cambacérès oversaw the legal reforms, he didn't make a speech about tolerance. He didn't argue that gay men were equal. He simply applied the logic of the Enlightenment. The law deals with public order. Private sin is God's problem, not the judge's. By removing the crime of sodomy from the penal code, he created a zone of freedom that didn't exist anywhere else in the world. This French model spread. As the Napoleonic Code was adopted by other nations, this silence was adopted with it. In 1811, the Netherlands decriminalized homosexuality. In 1830, Brazil. In 1858, the Ottoman Empire, influenced by French reforms. In 1871, the new German Empire adopted a penal code that did punish homosexuality. Paragraph 175, explicitly rejecting the French model, a decision that would lead to the horrors of the 20th century in Germany. But in the Latin world, France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and their colonies, the silence held. While Oscar Wilde was being sentenced to hard labor in England in 1895 for gross indecency, men in Paris could sit in cafes, live together, and publish books without fear of prison. They faced social stigma, yes. They faced religious judgment, certainly. But they did not face the state. Cambacérès, the terrified man who lived his life looking over his shoulder, had inadvertently become the godfather of modern privacy rights. He proved that the most effective way to protect a minority was sometimes just to get the government to ignore them. He never lived to see the gay rights movement. He would probably have been horrified by it. He was a conservative man who valued discretion above all else. He didn't want pride parades. He wanted quiet dinners. But without his pen, the history of human rights in Europe would have been a much darker story. So, who was Jean-Jacques-Régis de Cambacérès? History often overlooks the number twos. We are drawn to the charismatic leaders, the men who stand on balconies and scream. We look at Napoleon with his hand in his coat, staring at the pyramids. But Napoleon was a catastrophe. He left France smaller, poorer, and weaker than he found it. He killed 3 million Frenchmen for a dream that lasted less than a decade. Cambacérès was the antidote to Napoleon. Napoleon was the ego. Cambacérès was the superego. Napoleon was the breaker. Cambacérès was the fixer. Napoleon was the fire that burns down the forest. Cambacérès was the slow-growing oak that holds the soil together. His life was a masterpiece of contradiction. He was a revolutionary who loved order. He was a regicide who loved monarchy. He was a man who loved men. Yet he wrote the laws that defined the traditional family. He was a coward who showed immense courage by simply showing up to work every day while the world was falling apart. He proved that you don't have to be a hero to change the world. You don't have to lead a charge. You don't have to be a saint. Sometimes you just have to be the person who reads the fine print. You just have to be the person who knows how to keep the lights on when the storm hits. Imagine for a moment the dining room of his townhouse in Paris years after his death. The table is set. The silver is polished. The crystal glasses sparkle in the candlelight. But the chair at the head of the table is empty. The guests are gone. The laughter of the young secretaries, the whispers of the ministers, the booming voice of the emperor, all silence. But outside the window in the streets of Paris, life goes on. A young couple walks by, holding hands. They are going to the city hall to get married. They will sign a contract based on Article 212 of the Civil Code. A merchant is selling his shop to a partner. He is protected by the laws of contract drafted in 1804. Two men are walking home from a late dinner. They are talking quietly, safe in the knowledge that no police officer will arrest them for who they are. They do not know the name of the man who made their lives possible. They do not know about his velvet coats, his fear, or his lonely exile. They don't need to know his name. They are living in his house. Jean-Jacques-Régis de Cambacérès did not leave a dynasty of blood. He left a dynasty of ink. And while blood can be spilled and dynasties can fall, ink, if it is written with enough wisdom, is indelible. The emperor is dead. Long live the jurist.